America's oldest mystery finds its roots in a foreign land. An ambitious mayor, John White, formed the first permanent English colony in modern-day North Carolina. Following a trip home, the governor would return to an empty, no-man's land. This is the story of the Lost Colony of Roanoke. If we are to trace the English encounter with North America, we have to talk about Sir Walter Raleigh. Born in Devon, Britain, Raleigh had a keen sense of exploring the world and developing naval strategies to carry out his extensive travel plans. He was also known to be a patriot, and of course, his mother's friendship with Queen Elizabeth I had earned him a remarkable reputation for being a well-connected courtier. However, Sir Walter Raleigh would become famous for his obsession with establishing a permanent North American settlement. When his peers were mostly into exploring and quickly leaving, Raleigh was far more ambitious. He knew the settlement would yield several advantages that would make Britain the master of the New World, rather than just the old continent. A permanent settlement, particularly in modern-day North Carolina, would have been pretty useful. You see, it would have been ideal for harassing Spanish shipping that passed the shore, mining gold, and finding new passages to the Pacific. This ambitious project would lead to the establishment of the Roanoke colonies. The first reconnaissance venture on the outer banks of North Carolina was led by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow under the leadership of Raleigh. The duo landed in the area in 1584 and established friendly contact with the Algonquian-speaking natives, even making their journey back to Britain with two locals, Monteo and Wanchese. Their purpose was to learn more about the land and establish diplomatic relations with the tribes. They studied the area carefully and reported their findings to the Queen, who granted them official permission to settle in Virginia. Next year, John White and Thomas Harriot made their way to the Chesapeake Bay. The duo established a fortified camp on Roanoke Island in 1585, created maps of the area, and had an altercation that led them to eliminate the native chief, Pemisipan. In that order. It didn't help that the English had abandoned the colony once again, so they had to make a return trip. For the next voyage, Raleigh wanted his dream to become a reality. Back in England, Raleigh mourned the failed attempts to colonize the islands. The ambitious missions had gone down the drain because the English did not prepare their trips well enough. But, of course, the worst was yet to come. In 1587, Raleigh commissioned another voyage under the leadership of John White. The captain was so confident about the project and starting a whole new colony in America that he brought his family along. Intending to settle in Chesapeake, they diverted their attention to Roanoke, the island that would become their second home. Historical sources say that John White had brought along 115 English settlers who more and less had a mission. They had boarded the ship in London for religious reasons. Later that year, John White, the colony governor, decided to make a trip back to England. He had to update Raleigh about his success, and, at the same time, the settlers were running low on supplies. Their mission was working, of course, but they still needed time to adapt to the new land. White sailed back, but as he arrived home, a major naval war broke out between England and Spain. As a patriot and on the orders of the Queen, White decided to confront the Spanish Armada with his compatriots. It was August 1590 when White finally returned to Roanoke. You wouldn't believe what he encountered. Gone. Everyone was gone, including his wife, daughter, and infant granddaughter Virginia, who was born in Roanoke. White looked for his fellow settlers desperately, but he couldn't find a trace of anyone in the colony. It was almost like they had disappeared into thin air. All he saw was the word CROATOAN carved into a wooden post. The settlers had an agreement with White. If they had to move under duress, they would carve their location on the post with a cross over it. But the mayor did not see the cross sign anywhere. White believed that his fellow settlers and family were brutally murdered by the indigenous tribes present in the area. But as historians stand today, there's no concrete proof for White's assertion. White did not encounter any remains of the body or mass graves. If such remnants existed, they were perhaps shrouded away from the naked eye. You can make whatever you want of the mystery of CROATOAN. Even the historians don't have a consensus on what went down in Roanoke. But the word CROATOAN wasn't meaningless either. The island south of Roanoke was inhabited by the indigenous tribe, who called themselves CROATOAN. While settlers hadn't moved south yet, perhaps the indigenous tribes feared a hostile expansion. When they saw that the governor was gone for a considerable time, they made their move and possibly kidnapped or eliminated the settlers. Yet the story within itself feels incomplete or rather hollow. Some historians believe that holding CROATOAN complicit is a wild accusation. Sure, the indigenous tribes could have acted preemptively to counter the foreigners, but it's also largely possible that they simply took the settlers as their kin. The indigenous tribes were always on the move in search of food or looking for new settlements. Historians hypothesize that perhaps the CROATOAN tribe found them starved and abandoned and decided to take them to their remote, unmapped settlement that the English were unable to find. At least, the absence of the cross-carving would back that theory. What we can't ignore is that perhaps the settlers left under duress. In that case, they simply wouldn't have time to carve a cross, right? So, were the settlers taken away by force? Here's the thing. People don't just disappear without a trace. Throughout White's stay, the inhabitants of CROATOANs hadn't shown any hostility to the settlers. So, the theory about the extermination plan is perhaps a bit too ambitious. Not to mention, the indigenous tribes were not new to internal conflicts. Several times they had tried to use the English against each other, or for their advantage. There's a chance that they saw English settlers as an ally, or a source of valuable learning. But of course, the carving was the only clue that the English had left for White. It was highly likely that their disappearance was tied to the tribe in ways that are still being speculated. While it is believed that the colony was simply lost, we don't have enough proof to back the theory up. The native tribes still lived in the same area for the years to come. But why is it that John White didn't expand his search area? All we know is that he desperately tried to look for his family, but everything seemed to be a lost cause. There are other factors to consider, though. It is also speculated that the settlers had simply relocated by themselves, but their navigation skills came short. In the pursuit of finding a place with a stable supply of food and fresh water, they perhaps made a walk to resettle. But then something horrible happened, causing them to simply perish. And if that had happened, it is also very likely that the inexperienced English couldn't grapple with the seasonal changes of North America. Historians and geologists have also framed the Lost Colony as a climate change issue. The climate patterns of the time suggest that Roanoke could have had its fair share of a turbulent drought season. When White didn't return with supplies on time, the settlers were forced to make their own voyage. That perhaps didn't turn out well. The unpredictable weather and their lack of expertise would suggest that the sea had swallowed them. And with no population around, their cries for help simply went unheard. Some historians also speculated that perhaps it was an encounter with the Spanish that took the English colonists' lives. But there's no concrete proof for this theory. Perhaps the most fascinating theory comes from the historian and anthropologist Lee Miller, who believed Roanoke was a site of internal English politics. She theorized that settlers like Sir Francis Walsingham, Simon Fernandez, and Edward Strafford plotted the abandonment of the settlers to undermine Raleigh in the English court. Walsingham wanted to see Britain as a Protestant world power, while Raleigh was charitable to the separatists in the country. And since it was speculated that settlers had traveled to Roanoke to escape religious persecution in England, Walsingham wouldn't have let anyone rescue them. Yet again, the theory did not make much sense because Walsingham had heavily funded several expedition missions of Raleigh's. So, perhaps, they were still friendly despite their ideological beliefs. At the end of the day, all we know is that 115 people sailed to find a new home, and then they disappeared forever. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating historical mysteries.